Hello, my name is Francesca Ostuzzi, and I'm going to give you an introduction to design and open-ended design. I work at the University of Ghent, and I teach to industrial designers. I'm affiliated to two research groups, Design Nexus and the Center for Sustainable Development of UGent. And in both, I bring up my expertise and my focus on design for sustainability. Today, I'm going to speak, first of all, about design. What does design mean? And who is a designer? How do designers learn? Designers' way of knowing. And open-ended design. Finally, I'm going to provide some examples that I hope will help you in the challenge. Starting with what design is. So design can be defined as the process of creation of what does not exist yet. In fact, design constitutes an intentional act to modify reality. So when we design, we want to change the world to a better status. So while we design, we have a very interesting friction and tension between what is ideal and what is real. What is ideal is abstract, it's rather stable, it's under control, and of course it's in our head, in our theories. Well, what is real, it's concrete, dynamic, and very often out of our control. I'm going to get back to this tension later on in the presentation. But first of all, we said design is the process of creation of what does not exist yet. It's an intentional act to modify the world. And how does design work? It works through tangible outcomes. So a typical designer builds products, prototypes, to test some theories, some ideas, and again, to modify reality into a better status. Nonetheless, I usually like to change the word tangible into the word experientiable. Why? Because a good designer does not only design products, but also systems. For example, you see on the right side a sort of system thinking diagram or an information flow like the yellow one in the slide. So these, which might be virtual realities, are still made for others to be experienced. So that's how we design. Nonetheless, we don't have to be scared when we speak about design, because as Victor Papanek wrote in his book in 1971, Design for the Real World, all men are designers. All what we do, almost all the time, is design. For design is basic to all human activity. So in other words, everyone can design. Let me give you some examples. So when a kid wants to design an animal, he or she is also going through the process of creation of something that did not exist before, the sketch. As well, when we cook, we are starting from an abstract understanding of what the meal can look like, and then we transform it into something tangible. And finally, design is so broad that in fact, it's not only typical of human beings, but many other living organisms design things with a specific purpose of making their functions easier and their reality better. Let me focus for a second on the example of cooking. As I said, everyone can design. Nonetheless, there are very different levels of design and creativity that we can align to. The lowest level is the level of doing. We are motivated by productivity and we want something to be done. For example, in the example of cooking, organizing the herbs and spices in the shelves. So this is something at the lowest level of creativity, but nonetheless, it already can change reality. So we can reorganize things and still consider this a design act. A second level is the level of adapting. The goal, the motivation is that I want to appropriate something. So I want to make things my own. So for example, I might add some ingredients in a food, in a delivery that I received. So maybe I might not have cooked it, but yet I'm going to change it slightly so that that food that I ordered is specifically mine. Typical example is to add spices to a certain food. So also here, we are in fact designing. We are changing reality by adapting it to our needs and our taste in this case. The third level, higher level of creativity, is the one of making. So I want to assert my ability or skill to do something with my own hands. In this case, I could cook the food from scratch. So this is possible, and this is, I would say, one of the most typical and higher design acts where I think about something that maybe exists and I reproduce it. Nonetheless, the highest level of creativity is when we actually create something, so we make something in reality that did not exist yet at all. So in this sense, for example, I might be dreaming about a new dish that does not exist yet. In fact, the creating level very often builds upon the other levels. So when I'm creating something new, I'm very often adapting something that already exists and making it happen. So to repeat, we can all design, and maybe we can design at different levels as described in this slide. What is typical of design, and in this case also of professional designers, is that design is that discipline that bridges technology with humans. So a good designer has to speak and think about materials, production, distribution, assembly processes, and so on, but as well about what is the experience that comes with that material, that production, and so on. So in other words, a good designer asks him or herself, is this feasible? But also, is this desirable? And so this is something very important to keep in mind when taking up a design challenge. It's not only about the technical aspect, but is as much also about the human aspects. Furthermore, as designer, you never work alone. Designers can be defined as specialized generalists, meaning that a designer usually does not go in depth in the knowledge of one specific topic, but is really specialized of bridging different topics. In this sense, typically designers work in interdisciplinary teams, as well as it's going to happen in your challenge. Finally, a quote that I like to share from Bruno Munari is that the artist's dream is to get to the museum, whereas the designer dream is to reach the street market. This connects again to what the role is of a designer often, or in the idea of Brunari, which of course I share. And that is that the designer really wants to make things better. So it's not about popularity, it's really about changing reality. Okay, this said, the question is, how do design learn? Design, so in typical sciences, let's say, there are very different ways of creating knowledge. For example, there is the induction and the deduction. Design is considered using a mix of all of them, first of all, but also specifically the abduction. So in other ways, we could call it really a typical designerly way of knowing. So design is not a typical science, in this aspect could be seen as a discipline by its own. Let me give you some example of what do we mean with the design way of knowing. So how do we learn and how do we design as designers? So typically we have a problem and we have a solution. In some traditional sciences, we could at one point find a linear way to go from my problem to my solution. In design, we also have some steps that can inform us on how to move from the problem to the solution. The steps are the information, the exploration, the decision, and the test. Of course, different scholars might call these stages slightly differently, but the concepts are more or less shared and the same. And this is also what is commonly defined as the design thinking approach. So the first phase, it's the information gathering. You normally, at the start of every challenge, receive a briefing, a goal, a context situation, a problem, some information. Nonetheless, very often these information are ill-defined. So the first step of a good designer and a good design process is to gather more information. We need it because we need to redefine the briefing. We need to better understand what is exactly desired by my partners, by my stakeholders. And of course, it's also important to put some boundaries. So for example, you might say, okay, I can do this, but I cannot do that. So it's very important at the starting phase of each design process to somehow agree on what is possible to be done and what are the boundaries and also the deliverables. Of course, this phase also helps you to know better about the context you're going to study and design for. The second phase is the exploration. So this is the divergent phase. It's mainly the creative phase, meaning that at this point, we have to try to adopt as many points of view as possible. Typical for this phase is the brainstorm. So in this phase, we want to have a huge quantity of ideas. Very often to my students, I ask in 1 week to produce 100 different ideas. And this is possible when you are very open to change the point of view and to explore even ideas that might not work in reality, then you're exploring and diverging in a good way. Following this very open phase of exploration, you have to start converging. So in the quantity of ideas, of course, there are some ideas not feasible, some are not reasonable, some are not desirable. So this is the moment to choose them. So you have to discard some ideas and maybe you can combine some ideas. Maybe 2 ideas can coexist. So you have to make a selection of what can be done. Of course, the selection is based on a set of criteria that are very context dependent. For example, if you have a budget, you might choose the ideas that align with your budget. If you have a time frame, for example, you are doing a challenge that lasts only a few days or months, well, then it's very important that you decide upon what you can bring further for the time being. And finally, once you have decided what to do, you can move to test it. Tests can take many different shapes. For example, already to communicate your ideas with other people is a way of testing it. And that's why we usually are so afraid of sharing our ideas when they're not final. Nonetheless, this is very important because we learn from it. So the test can also be to build a prototype and to put it in the real environment and observe how the users use it. Can be, for example, interviewing, making a survey. So it can take very different shapes. The goal of the test, nonetheless, is not to finally converge to a full solution, but it's to learn about your design. Is your design really feasible? Is your design really desirable? Why am I saying that it does not conclude here? Because in fact, the real way or the best way to look at the design process is to look at it not as a linear process, which again might be typical of other disciplines, but as a spiral. So I start gathering information, I explore my problem, I take some decisions, I test them, and at that point, I'm far from being finished. In fact, I have to start by testing already. I gather new information, I learn new things, and therefore I can diverge again, explore, I can converge again, take more decisions, and test again. In fact, every design process requires several iterations. It's very hard to imagine that only one iteration will bring to a good solution. Of course, the more we iterate, the more we learn. So design could be seen as a never-ending process. What is important often in a good design process to end is to have a deadline. And why am I saying it's actually a never-ending process? Because every solution we might find will bring new problems. So when we speak about design, in reality, we are not speaking about a linear process. We are speaking a highly iterative process that continues and converges like a spiral. Furthermore, at the beginning of the design process, we don't know too many things. So this is called fuzzy front end, and is a bit of a paradox of the designer profession, because we need to iterate, we need to gather information, to explore, to decide, and to test. And yet we know that we don't know enough about the problem. And yet we need to do this so that we learn. So that's a bit the paradox. But how can we do that? Well, what is important to proceed when we are exploring the fuzzy front end, so when we don't know yet which direction we are going to take, well, what is important is that we keep on doing things. So this is a summary of the kind of information that we can gather while we design. So some information are more superficial and more accessible to everyone, and they are the information that have been said and can be said and are very explicit. But if you start doing things and making people, for example, using things, well, then you can observe. And the information we can observe are actually deeper of the information that we can only say. And then we can make or co-design things with some users. And then we reach a higher depth about what they really feel and dream, which is really often tacit and latent. So to give you an example, if I ask to a test user something, he or she might say what he or she thinks will do in the real situation. But if I put the person in front of, for example, a prototype, well, the person then will act more spontaneously in a way that maybe was unexpected also for him or her. So as I mentioned, I work for the University of Ghent, and the motto of the University of Ghent is dare to think. Well, in Campus Kortrijk, where I teach, we like to say that our motto is dare to think while doing. So again, how do we overcome the fuzziness of the design process? Well, we overcome it by doing things, by testing out things, by taking decisions. And these decisions are not oriented to find a solution, but are oriented to understand better the context I'm designing for. And finally, how can open-ended help us in designing for the context you're going to design in this challenge? As I mentioned before, there is a very interesting tension. When we design, we think about something very abstract, and then when we put it in reality, this something is in fact very different than what we expected. And that's also why it's so important to test, because reality is in fact different than what we expect or can anticipate. But let me give you a concrete example. So when I was a student, when I was designing to become a designer, I was often asked by my professors to design choosing the perfect material, choosing the perfect shape. So I was very much pushed into this idea of finding one solution, one perfect idea. But reality is very different. So for my master thesis, which then became my PhD thesis, just a small experiment, I took 5 different vases of 5 different materials, and I actually kept them for a year and I used them. So just normal use, which is what we have to do with the products we eventually design. So what I observed after a few months is that, in fact, these products are very dynamic. They do change. You see to the left, the paper one is more subject to change, but also the metal one had some rusting effect, and the wooden one also started rotting. And so my question was at the time, and still is nowadays, why don't we design for the real? Why do we design with this idea of perfection that in fact does not exist? So in my observation, also with the test of the vases and other examples I'm going to give you in a second, products are not static. They're actually dynamic. And that's why there is a very interesting friction between what we think, the ideal world, and the real world. So products, in fact, if they are good products, they interact with their ecology, meaning that if I have a vase, for example, and I use it, well, this vase will change according to how I use it, where I use it, and so on. So from being ideal, as I thought it to be, my product becomes real, becomes a unique expression of it. This has been defined as the ultimate particular. So each product, even an industrial produced one, can have a very unique end, depending on how the ecology, that can be the user, but can also be the weather. So all human and non-human actors make use of it. But let me give you some more examples to give the context of this reflection. So these are just very common objects or realities I was surrounded with in my years of studies. So for example, one of my favorite cups fell down and broke and became actually quite dangerous to be used. For this reason, I had to throw it away. So it became waste because it was dangerous to be used. Here is still when I was living in Italy, in Milano. There were some information boards made of plastics. And during an especially warm summer, they melted down. So also in this case, this information board became waste because they cannot be used anymore. They are not safe. And they're not delivering the information they are supposed to deliver. But in fact, there are other examples of products that do change, but change to a better status. So they don't become waste. They are not thrown away because they change, but on the contrary. So as you understood, I'm actually Italian. And as you might know, in Italy, we tend to drink coffee with this typical Bialetti coffee machine. This coffee machine is made in aluminum. It's an aluminum cast and has the particular capacity of creating a layer that actually protects the material. So when you buy the new Bialetti, you might read in the information, in the instruction, that they suggest to actually use the machine 2-3 times before drinking the coffee. And then it is known that you should never wash the machine so hard because you don't want to take away this patina that gets created in the surface of the machine, because this patina brings a better taste to the coffee. So in some ways, the coffee machine follows a different path than what we saw so far. It actually is created somehow imperfect, and thanks to the use I make of it, it becomes better and better and better. And this is a typical product that you might really keep forever in your household. Another example, again in Italy, is about the statue of Giulietta, of Romeo and Julia in Verona. Also, this statue has the particularity of having an oxidation layer on the surface. That's typical of these materials. So, in fact, the statue grows old and becomes more dirty to some extent, or can be perceived as such. So this layer, which in other products might be perceived as a disvalue, in fact, in this product is really delivering us very interesting information, because as you might imagine, it is believed that touching Giulietta brings good luck. And so tourists queue in front of the statue to go and touch the statue. In fact, I can tell you, I observe the tourists very often, and I can tell you, they do not ask where should I touch Giulietta, because the statue is hinting at it. If you can see, there are some areas of the statue that are very, very shiny. That is because by touching the statue, we are tearing away the oxidation layer. So the material in this case is telling us what kind of use and what kind of history the statue has. And then finally, this is an example I've seen in Ghent. Products might also change, not physically. So before we spoke about changing shape, melting, oxidating, but they might change in the meaning. So in fact, users, as I mentioned also before, are creative. In this case, we see a possible kayak user who saw the potential of storing his kayak into the bicycle rack of the city. So again, in this case, the product did change, not in its physical features, but in its meaning. So following this observation, it's clear that products are never fully finished. Products are ongoing, precarious, dynamic, and emergent. In other words, products are open-ended. So there is no such a thing as perfection when we understand that when we design, we have to design for something that will keep existing and will keep existing out of our control. So we'll keep on changing. This perspective, it's rather disruptive in the industrialized world, Western world we live in. But it's very typical actually of other countries. For example, Japan has an aesthetic philosophy, very ancient, called wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi is defined as the beauty of things that are imperfect and that are temporary. So wabi-sabi is represented in many arts. For example, the ikebana, that you see the flower composition. So the beauty of the flower composition in the wabi-sabi aesthetics is not the beauty of our typical flowers that are meant to last forever, as nice as possible. On the contrary, it's a beauty that is really defined by the fact that the plant and the flowers somehow decay in time. To give another example of wabi-sabi, this is a bowl, and it's considered the most beautiful wabi-sabi object. And why is so? This is actually a very normal bowl, and it's made to be used. And even more, the product in its cracks and its discolorment shows that it has been used. So this bowl has also been defined as healthy. It is an healthy design product. So I know many of you are not designers as profession, but here is really the perspective switch. Industrial designers are typically nowadays educated to design for perfection, for things that should not change, but reality keeps on putting us in front of the fact that things will change. And especially they will change if they will be used, which is really the goal we want to achieve as designers. And so trying to change this perspective can have a very big impact in our culture. So in other words, in the perspective that I'm trying to suggest, we go from an ideal world in our head where everything is perfect and under control to a real world that is imperfect, unexpected, and out of control. This real world will change, but this change will not lead necessarily to waste, will lead to beauty. And of course, beauty in this context is not only the aesthetical beauty, it's really the idea of being healthy, of being used. So it's really a broader scope or broader sense of beauty. So something that, because changes in time and use, becomes better. So think of the mocha example. So in other words, if we take and embrace this perspective, we realize very quickly that waste is really just a name we give to things, because things changed in a way that we did not like, we did not expect, we did not anticipate, and therefore they become waste for us. But we know very well many of the resources and products that get wasted are not really waste, are still very useful and can be having a very high potential. So by designing in an open-ended way, we design with a time perspective, and we design being open for the fact that unexpected things will happen. So by doing so, we can give to waste a new name and meaning. But let me give you some example, because this last part was probably a bit theoretical. So this is a product, is a marble sink top. I guess more or less everyone has experience of this kind of product. This is another product, is done in the same material. It's a cutting board. It's a cutting board with a small hook that can be hung at the wall in your kitchen, for example. What might not be super clear at the first glimpse is that this second product is in fact the waste of production, which in technical terms we call scrap of production of the first product. So in the sketch in the middle, you see that the cutting board is exactly the piece that gets thrown away when I produce the sink top. And the small hook that helps me hanging it at the wall is in fact there only because it's the need for the machine. So the machine is following that path that is highlighted by the arrow. So that is not ruining my sink, my table, my sink top. So the hook comes with the process. There is no change in the scrap of production. It's only a change of meaning, as we saw before. How does this happen? Well, when a good designer looks with creative eyes. So this designer is Paolo Julian, is an Italian designer. And what he does systematically is to look into the scraps of production of many companies and trying to redesign starting from that. Again, this material is not waste. We call it waste when our creativity is limited in finding opportunities. So a strategy that I can suggest to you is to open-ended design by, for example, reevaluating scraps of production. Another example from the same designer is called Una Seconda Vita. So this is a terracotta centerpiece. You have to imagine as a rather big. So it's a big vase. Here, what the designer is doing, it's a bit different and very, very interesting. So he's designing in time, trying to anticipate possible scenarios. So what he says is, okay, I don't want my user to throw this vase to the floor. There is no reason for doing that. But if that would happen, well, then I'm designing this for already having a second life. So in case this vase, this centerpiece would fall to the ground, because of the decoration, you see the small holes, we know that the rupture is likely to start from from the decoration. That's an imperfection of the structure, in fact. And so from the bigger centerpiece, I can obtain 6 smaller dishes that I can still use, for example, for key holder and so on. So this is a strategy that I suggest you as well, and it's open-ended design, already having in mind a second, third, fourth life of your product. So try to imagine, what if the product breaks down? What if the product grow old? What if, and try to be creative in thinking, okay, I make it not become waste at that point. I try to postpone it by envisioning, for example, new functions. Another very interesting example is this incremental house from Elemental. Here, the waste is much more complicated or on a higher level. So what they did observe is that, so after big disasters, for example, earthquakes, the government gives some containers, some houses, some facilities to the citizens to live in. Very often these facilities get in fact abandoned after a few years. This, of course, it's understandable because for many reasons they are not the most the nicest places to live in. So, but nonetheless, the government has also to keep the costs contained. So there are many aspects, of course, you can reflect further on them because there is no time to provide the full complexity. But what is important here to think that the designers did is that they decided to say, okay, we will keep costs contained and we will design half of a house. So they provided these houses where, as you can see, one half is completely empty. And the idea is that it's empty so people who live in them can reappropriate them. And in fact, it's interesting because we also don't know what kind of family is going to live in this house. So if I leave openness, I let persons personalize their spaces. So some might build a terrace, some might put a garage or other things. So it's very interesting to see in the pictures that many houses became very different in a way that was very unexpected. So in this way, you can imagine to try to decrease waste by by designing in an open-ended way unfinished products, so that you trigger the participation of your users. So you can design something that is not finished. In fact, we don't dare to do that often as designers, but if you do that, then you know you might trigger participation, and triggering participation can in return trigger higher emotional value and higher fit. So as well trigger longer lifespans for the product. Another interesting example is given by the complexity of the renovation processes in old houses. As you know, houses have a huge variety of materials. You see here, you have the bricks, you have the tiles, you have nails, glass, and so on. And when you tear down a house, you actually tend to mix all of them because the houses have not been designed for disassembly, which of course it's a good strategy to decrease waste. But they have been designed with other kind of design strategies. And so when you tear them down, you tend to mix all materials, making recycling and reusing very hard. Nevertheless, the idea of this designer, Dave Hackens, is to really try to reuse as much as possible the materials of the old house into the new building. How does he do that? He actually designed a series of floors and bricks, typical terrazzo tiles are called, really giving some recipes to the users on what kind of materials from the old house to use to then generate the new floor, in this case for the new house. In this case, the suggestion is to follow a strategy of open-ended design where you actually design processes for reuse. So it's not designing the tile to be sold, it's really designing a process where everyone could actually take part to while renovating the house. Another example is to use also different materials. Why is this so interesting? So in the picture, you see a mycelium-based material. Mycelium is the vegetative part of the fungi. So mushrooms are the fruits of mycelium. And why it's so interesting? Because it's a very natural material and it's fully biodegradable and compostable. And why is it so important? Because in fact, as designers, as I mentioned before, we tend to think in terms of perfection, in terms that things will not change. And also we tend to think that things will last very long. But one of the main problems of sustainability is really that we design products with very long-lasting materials, for example, plastics, but then the products get discarded very quickly. So we design thrown away products with very long-lasting materials. So the idea here is that we cannot force every product to last long. We can have products that last short time. Okay, if we do that, then we can use very different materials that close the loop in other ways, so that completely disappear, becoming again food for the system. So the example, this is a project of Michiel Wierink, a former student of mine. He designed actually an urn. So when after cremation, he thought about designing an urn with this mycelium material that in fact can be planted in the ground, completely closing the loop of in this case, a life cycle in general, but again, really giving back to the earth what came from the earth. So this, of course, it's a very symbolic project as well. But we can think that many products can be designed following this strategy. So the strategy for short life products, for example, thrown away products or products that at one point will have to end their life anyways, so not longer lasting products as some of the examples we saw before. Well, the strategy in this case can really be designing for vanishing acts. So how can I make the end of life of my product at zero impact as far as this is possible? Okay, so I gave you some example of very different strategies that you can use in your challenge. As well, I introduced to you what design is and how do we think as designers. But why is design so important? In fact, when we design, we want to change the world. And really, we can have this impact. Because when we change products, in fact, we are also changing our own perception on them. So if we stop calling waste something that now can be defined waste, we have completely reached a very different perspective on reality. And so by having this new perspective, we might be able to design new products in a different way. So we might really be able to break the industrial paradigms that want products to be perfect and that therefore disregard everything that is not perfect and by putting the name of waste. Furthermore, this is a process that is not a solitary process. It's a process that I see collective. So the more we will design in new and different ways, the more we will change the people around us and society. Of course, this is a process that takes time, but it's a process that I'm confident will really happen. So I really wish you good luck with the challenge and with the Wanderful.Stream project.